1.6x, 2x, Desqueeze, 2.66 to 1, 2.4 to 1? What does it all mean? What's up, guys? In this video, we're going to unpack anamorphic lenses, specifically field of view. I want to preface this video by saying that I'm not going to focus on things like the squeezy bokeh or flares and some of those more typical anamorphic elements, right? There's plenty of videos out there that talk about these kind of classical elements of anamorphic lenses, all right? And I would actually recommend you check out the YouTube channel Anamorphic on a Budget to really get to see a wide range of anamorphic lenses and the different types of looks they provide. Here, I really wanted to make this video, honestly, to learn myself and help you guys understand just how much actual field of view and what's in the frame when you are capturing footage on an anamorphic lens, and how the squeeze factor impacts that, as well as the sensor size or area of the sensor in a camera that you're using. So we're going to do a little bit of math, but it's not going to be too complicated. Today we're going to be looking at a couple anamorphic lenses and an anamorphic adapter. Right here I've got the Sirui 50mm 1.6x anamorphic lens. And here I've got the Laowa Nanomorph, also 50mm 1.5x anamorphic lens. So this one is a 1.6x Desqueeze, this one is a 1.5x Desqueeze. They're both 50mm lenses. And for reference, what I'm shooting this video on is a 50mm spherical lens, the Sirui Jupiter EF mount spherical lens, and we are on the RED Komodo. Okay, and on top of these two lenses, I've also got the Sirui 1.25x anamorphic adapter. So this can be used with a spherical lens to give a little bit of a Desqueeze anamorphic look, but really it's made to be paired with their 1.6x anamorphic lenses. When you multiply 1.6x to 1.25x, you get a 2x Desqueeze. So we're going to be looking at that. So a 1.5x Desqueeze on a 50mm lens, a 1.6x on a 50mm lens, and a 2x on a 50mm lens. Okay, so let's talk about Desqueeze. When you want to think about the actual field of view of an anamorphic lens, in theory, right, what you're going to do is you're going to take the focal length of your lens, in my case we got 50mm, then you're going to actually divide that by the Desqueeze. So I'm going to bring up my calculator here. If we divide 50mm by 1.6x, that's going to give us around a 31mm field of view, in theory, right? If we divide a 50mm lens by 1.5, that's going to give us around a 33mm point of view. And if we divide a 50mm by 2x, we're going to get a 25mm field of view. So really an anamorphic lens it's going to give you a much wider field of view on the horizontal, the left and right sides of your frame, than what the actual field of view of the spherical equivalent is. I am using the RED Komodo, which is a Super 35 sensor. Those numbers that I just shared with you are for full frame sensors. Now, the 50mm lens that I'm shooting on right now, that is a full frame lens, and I'm using a speed booster. And what the speed booster does is it's going to take the Super 35 sensor of the RED Komodo, which is around 1.4 to 1.5 times zoomed in, if you will, from a full frame sensor, and it's going to widen that sensor to full frame. So a 50 millimeter lens is going to be a 50 millimeter lens, full frame, with the speed booster. Now pay attention to the left and right sides of the frame. You can see the lights, for example, going right to the edge of the frame over here. So keep that in mind, and we'll be looking at that and comparing this 50 millimeter field of view to the field of view when we use the 50 millimeter anamorphic lenses at these different D-squeeze ratios. Because of the crop factor of the RED Komodo, we have to do a little bit of extra math here, okay? Before, what we did was we divided 50 millimeters by 1.5x. We got around 33 1/3 millimeter field of view, but now I have to multiply that by the crop factor of the Komodo's Super 35 sensor, which is around 1.4 times. So I'm going to multiply 33 times 1.4, and that's going to give me around a 46 to 47 millimeter field of view, pretty close to 50 millimeters. Now with the 1.6x D-squeeze lens here, again, we're going to go back and we're going to do 50 millimeters divided by 1.6, okay, around 31 1/4. But then we're going to multiply that now by the Komodo's 1.4 crop factor, and that's going to give us about a 44 millimeter field of view. This lens right here is going to give us a little bit more, a little bit closer to that 50 millimeter field of view when we take into account the Komodo's crop factor. This lens is going to be a little bit wider than that because of the larger D-squeeze. Now, if we pair the adapter, so 50 divided by 2 is going to be 25, and then we multiply that 25 by the 1.4 times crop factor of the Komodo, and that's going to give us, in theory, a 35 millimeter field of view. Now I've got a 35 millimeter full frame lens that I can add on later, so we can actually compare the, in theory, 35 millimeter field of view from the 2x anamorphic 50 millimeter lens, the horizontal field of view, to an actual 35 millimeter full frame lens and see just how close they are. But we need to also take into consideration the actual sensor size or portion of the sensor that's being used. The RED Komodo is a really great camera for this because it has all these different ways that you can kind of crop in on the sensor. You can shoot in 16:9, typical widescreen, or 17:9, cinematic widescreen, or you can go to a 2.4 to 1, super widescreen, or you can use a 3:2 portion of the sensor, or a 4:3 portion of the sensor, even a 6:5 almost fully square portion of the sensor. The actual dimensions of the sensor are 17:9. So that is a widescreen sensor. And if you were to use a 3:2 portion of the sensor, it's going to crop in on the left and right sides. Or if you used a 4:3 portion of the sensor or a 6:5 portion of the sensor, it's going to get more and more square. Now, why would you do that? The RED Komodo comes with all these sensor size presets, but you don't necessarily have to use them. They're really presets that are sort of aligned to film standards. So if we're using a 1.6x D-squeeze, then the Komodo actually, it recommends with the preset to use a 3:2 portion of the sensor. So 3/2 is 1.5 multiplied by 1.6. That's going to give you a 2.4 to 1 aspect ratio. So that's a very classically cinematic aspect ratio. With a 2x D-squeeze, there's a preset to use a 4:3 aspect ratio. So 4/3 is 1.33, multiply that by 2, and we get a final 2.66 to 1 aspect ratio. Also a similarly very cinematic field of view. 2.4 to 1, 2.66 to 1. These are aspect ratios that if you, see a lot of classical Hollywood films, or even modern films like Oppenheimer, a lot of films that Quentin Tarantino has shot, Scorsese, many famous directors, they're using this really widescreen 2.4 to 1 or 2.66 to 1 aspect ratio. So that's gonna, that's sort of the ratio that you'll get in the end based on that, the D-squeeze of the lens and the sensor size of the camera. But that, in theory would not impact your field of view, the actual field of view that you would get out of the lens, all that math that I was doing earlier in the video. But it's actually not that simple because as we crop in on the sensor, we're cropping in on the field of view of the lens. Even if I was using, the speed booster and this full frame lens, that kind of gets over the super 35 crop factor of the Komodo's overall sensor. But then if I chose, not to use a full ratio, 17:9 or 16:9 portion of the Komodo sensor, but actually used a smaller 3:2 or 4:3 or 6:5 portion of the sensor, we're losing field of view on the left and right sides. I'm going to use a range of sensor sizes. So I'm going to use a 16:9 sensor for all of these lenses. I'm going to use a 3:2 sensor size, and I'm going to use a 4:3 sensor size. Okay guys, that was enough math. Let's get into it. So now we are going to head into DaVinci Resolve and start taking a closer look at this footage. All right, so here we are in DaVinci Resolve, and I want to show you guys a cool little trick. This may work in Premiere and Final Cut, but I'm going to be showing you how to actually do this in Resolve, and this is in regards to working specifically with anamorphic footage. Because anamorphic footage has different D-squeeze ratios, the footage initially would come in kind of squished in the wrong direction, and you need to actually stretch it or de-squeeze it along the x-axis, so really scale it along the x-axis in order to get it to look correct. So for example, with 1.5x d-squeeze, you would scale the footage 1.5 times on the x-axis. So if your scale was set to 100% on x, you would scale it to 150%, 1.5 times. But in Resolve, we have this nice little trick where I've got my media here in the media pool. I can right click on it and go to the clip attributes. And right here, the pixel aspect ratio. This is basically the size of each pixel of the image, the ratio x to y, which should be familiar to you in regards to aspect ratios when it comes to footage. So all we need to do is just set this to a preset that works with our particular D-squeeze. So in my case, 1.5, it's actually already set up. What's really nice with footage shot on RED cameras is that this pixel aspect ratio is already going to be set up for you. But notice that for the 1.6x footage, you just need to go to Custom and then type that in. I'll show you what that actually looks like. So with the 1.6x clips, if I go to their clip attributes, I just have a custom pixel aspect ratio and I just typed in 1.6. So now when you actually scale your footage, if you need to scale it up or down, it's going to scale proportionally to the correct D-squeeze ratio automatically. So that is a really nice little trick. So let's take a look at our footage here. So right here, I've got footage that was shot on the Laowa Nanomorph lens. That was the 1.5x Desqueeze lens here, and let's just play through it. You can see with the text on the screen that I've notated which clips are coming from each of the different aspect ratios on the sensor, with the 50 millimeter clip being in the upper left, and then we have 16 by 9 in the upper right, 3 by 2 on the bottom left, and 4 by 3 in the bottom right. So already you're probably noticing that the 16 by 9 footage compared to the 3 by 2 and 4 by 3 has the largest field of view. So when you use that portion of the sensor, that full 16 by 9 sensor, you're going to get the most field of view. Like I said before, when you use the 3 by 2 or 4 by 3 portions of the sensor, you're cropping in on the left and right sides, so your field of view is getting cropped in on. Let's take a look now at the 1.6x Sous-ray lens. So again, we have these 4 different views here, 50 millimeter in the upper left, and then the 3 different aspect ratios on the sensor with the 1.6x Desqueeze. Now, just notice that the 16 by 9 aspect ratio, while it is using the full Komodo sensor, so you're going to get the most field of view, you should notice that the top and bottom is getting more and more cropped though. Lastly, let's look at the 2x desqueezed footage here. So I also used a 35 millimeter full frame lens instead of the 50 millimeter lens because of that math we did earlier, which with the 2x desqueeze on a 50 millimeter lens and the Komodo's crop factor should give us close to a 35 millimeter field of view. Interestingly, on the 16 by 9 aspect ratio portion of the sensor, the full Komodo sensor, we're actually getting a field of view larger than 35 millimeters, if you can believe that. But look at how much crop there is on the top and bottom. That is a really extreme aspect ratio that we're getting in the end, probably more than a 3-to-1 aspect ratio there. This is kind of the reason why there are these specific sensor size presets when it comes to the Komodo in regards to working with specific desqueezes. Because yes, while you can use the full 16 by 9 portion of the sensor and get just the absolute most field of view out of your anamorphic lens, if you're using a larger desqueeze like a 2x, and that 16 by 9 aspect ratio on the sensor, your final image aspect ratio is just going to be super wide. Now that's an interesting look. You might want to go for that look, but it's a very uncommon aspect ratio, even compared to the wider cinematic aspect ratios of 2.4 to 1 or 2.66 to 1. So you just have to kind of find that balance, right? All right, guys, so the conclusion here is that if you want to get the most out of your anamorphic lenses, you should pick a desqueeze that works best with the overall size of your camera sensor. So in the case of the RED Komodo, which has a 16 by 9 sensor, I would actually choose a 1.5x lens, the Laowa Nanomorph series, for example, because using that full 16 by 9 portion of the sensor there, you're going to get around a 2.4 to 2.6 aspect ratio in the end, and you'll be getting the full field of view of the Komodo sensor and taking advantage of the additional field of view you get by using that anamorphic lens. Now, if you were going to use, say, an anamorphic lens that had a 2x desqueeze, and you wanted a 2.4 to 1 aspect ratio in the end, then you're going to want to find a camera where you can actually shoot a 4:3 portion of the sensor, or at least that the camera's overall sensor should be 4:3 if you can, have access to that full sensor. Well, if you've made it this far in the video, guys, then I really commend you for sticking it through with me. To end here, I'm gonna play 2 sequences for you that I shot. One was shot on the Laowa Nanomorph lens, the 1.5x Desqueeze, and the other was shot on the Sirui lens with the adapter, so it was a 2x Desqueeze. I basically tried to shoot the sequence shot for shot as closely as possible, but I used 2 different sensor sizes for each of these. Right, so I used a 16:9 portion of the sensor for the 1.5x lens, and I used a 4:3 portion of the sensor for the 2x lens. And you'll see how close these 2, images came in the end, despite the different Desqueeze ratios. Really what it comes down to is, in terms of field of view, that overall portion or how much of the sensor you're using. So let me know in the comments down below which sequence you think was shot on which lens. All right, guys, thanks for sticking through to the end here. Enjoy.